Please join me in the spirit of prayer and meditation, and soon there'll be a photo that we will share to help us ground ourselves in this moment. I'm going to tell you a story about this picture that I took. I traveled to Portland, Oregon for General Assembly. And I made a point of arriving a few days early. I explained to a friend of mine who lived there that I needed to go to the mountains because my life was so busy. Always going, always doing, always in motion. And I felt that I had become so separate from nature that I had not been able to see the small, beautiful things around me on a daily basis. I felt I needed to go to the mountains where everything was just so big and so grand that I could not even choose to ignore it. I needed to find myself grounded again. I needed to feel my feet barefoot on the earth, is what my soul kept telling me. And that's partly why I wanted to sing that song about the tree, about standing firm on the earth. So my friend kindly took some time off, and he took me to the mountains. And along the highway to Mount Hood, there were a series of waterfalls coming down from the mountain, and some were really large and very easily accessible, and tourist buses were in the parking lot and lots of people were there. Some were small and took a little time to hike to. And we stopped at one of the smaller, less visited waterfalls. And this particular fall was inaccessible in general, except if you could get right up to the path. If you see this path here, this little path. It was a small little path you could see worn by other travelers that led to a natural platform of a really large rock, albeit very slippery and wet because it was by the side of the waterfall. And at first, I rationalized observing the fall from afar was fine. There was a bench, and I could sit and I could contemplate. So I sat. And then I thought to myself, I might slip, I might get wet, my shoes might get muddy, but I was drawn to get closer, that feeling of wanting to feel my feet barefoot on the earth. So I followed that path, and I stood on that rock overwhelmed by the pounding of water as it tumbled down from the mountainside into a deep pool at by my feet. And I felt the cold spray on my face. I became transfixed by the sensation of small water droplets that were forming on my cheeks. And at that moment, next to the falls, I was not aware of the future or of the past. I was simply in the present. And it took my breath away. I realized that what was mixing in with the water droplets, which was made of melted snow, were my tears. They were tears of joy, tears of recognition with the grandness and the beauty of the natural earth. And they were tears of grief. I acknowledged that I had become so busy with my goals that I no longer stopped. Just stop, just to be still and to be silent and to recognize what it felt like to be home again in my body. Someone once said, life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away. I invite you now, in this moment, to join me in our meditation by finding a comfortable position on your chair. And to feel your feet on the earth. And to breathe deeply. When I am sitting in a chair like this relaxing, I feel the weight of gravity pulling me down. And I feel my bones supported, and I relax my hands. And I become one with the present moment. I invite you to remember a time when you were also present to the natural beauty around you. Perhaps it was a beautiful or exotic place, maybe in the mountains or by the ocean. Perhaps it was long ago, or perhaps it was this morning in your backyard, watering your garden. Wherever that is, let yourself go there. And figuratively, take your shoes off and feel your feet barefoot on the earth. Listen to your body. Acknowledge what it has to tell you. And choose to remember this moment. To feel beauty all around you and to be present in this moment. May it be so. So many of you know that I grew up Unitarian Universalist myself, and many generations of Unitarians before me were in my family. And one of the things that I found so interesting in meeting and talking with my grandmother on my mother's side is that she was a Christian Unitarian, and then my mother was a Humanist Unitarian. And then around the time right before I was born, there was the merger, and I recognized myself later on as a Unitarian Universalist. So this shift within one theological shift over time was something that I experienced even in my own family. As I grew up a Unitarian Universalist, I knew by the time I was about 18 or 19 that one of the aspirations I had in my life was to go into ministry. And that became a part of my identity, a part of my story as being a part of our congregations. And so as I spoke about my personal journey to be prepared for ministry later on in life, because I certainly did not feel ready at 19, I talk with many different people about their theological perspectives about Unitarianism and Universalism and Unitarian Universalism and what does that even mean. And when I meet people outside of our congregation, one of the things that we talk about is, what does this long name even mean? How do we come up with Unitarian Universalism, and what is that even connected to? I know for me, the names relate to old arguments, old debates about the unity of God or the Trinity of God and Son and Holy Spirit. And Universalism, in its simple form, is about salvation for all. But what does this have to do with us gathering today, right here, right now? And what I explain to people that are outside of our denomination that I meet, and they say, what do you do for work? And I say, I'm a minister, Unitarian Universalist minister. And they say, oh, what is that? And we all have our elevator speeches, right? Well, I try not to give an elevator speech that is too long and full of history. Instead, what I say is, it's a place that challenges me. It's a place that helps me become the person that I want to be by being in relationship with others, and the principles that guide me on my daily journey, when I do that in community, help me become the person that I feel I'm meant to be. And for those who come across this threshold of this sanctuary, or any of our sanctuaries, what we are grounding ourselves in is our history of religious tradition. And so much of what we do is talk about our histories, talk about who we are, talk about our goals. I've heard people say sometimes that they miss the ritual of perhaps the church they grew up in. I don't know about you, but I went to Catholic school by choice, actually. And the ritual was so much a part of the service. And Episcopal church services, up and down and up and down. And did many of you grow up in a congregation where you had certain rituals and they still ground you in your memories of what church is? I have a friend who in seminary moved from Catholicism in his life to Unitarian Universalism, and he said that one of the things that he experienced is that he felt like he had thrown the baby out with the bathwater, because what he had was something theologically that made sense to him, but he still missed the ritual. He still missed the grounding of something that for him was that spiritual core. So what is this division for us between what we have as our vision of who we are and what we do together? I know that it was important for me to learn about our history of Transcendentalism, because we have inherited two different theological histories, and Transcendentalism is a time for me which helps me ground myself in a language of reverence. So Transcendentalism started in the mid-1800s, and it was a liberal religious path in the United States and also in Western Europe, in which people recognized that they felt like God was afar. God was separated from you, and your place of coming to be a part of that is only in the church building, only in the sanctuary, only in the cathedral. And instead, Transcendentalism was an acknowledgement that God was a part of you, and God was everywhere. And for many, there's the notion of, for me to feel the most connected to the divine was to go instead into nature. And I know many of us here have that connection. I see Meg shaking her head. I know that that's certainly a case for you. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a Transcendentalist Unitarian minister who emphasized that our intuition, our imagination, our sense of connection to nature was our connection to the divine. And he wrote, "I would find myself in God's sanctuary by walking in the woods alone, quiet and still with the wind on my cheeks, and I could hear the bird song and know that that was God's voice. And it was not something separate from him," he said. "God was there, and I was a part of it." So we have Transcendentalism in our history, and we also have humanism. How many of you have studied or read the Humanist Manifesto? Well, it's a kind of a dry document. However, it was a seminal body of thought that was the convergence in 1933 of religious and social and scientific perspectives of the time. And science at that time was offering a new understanding of the universe as a whole and our place in it. And the manifesto signers were attempting to introduce us to a new sense of religion, one that left myth and symbols and rituals all behind us because human reason was all we needed. Talk about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. With its emphasis on reason and intellect, humanism had little place for qualities such as awe and reverence. It understood the religious dimension to include all of life, but believed that it manifested in a heightened sense of personal life and in a cooperative effort to promote social well-being. Humanism, at its core, was about finding the foundation for expanding humanity's potential. Yet this hallmark of liberal religion cut out all the language of reverence. So Transcendentalism and humanism were kind of at each other's perspectives without a way of finding a place in between. I know growing up as a Unitarian Universalist, for me, and talking to my mother and my grandmother about our histories and our identities and our theologies that made us feel connected to something larger. There were two large churches in Houston, and one was very transcendentalist and connected to the religious background of being Unitarian and Protestant. And the other was very humanist, without much ritual or language of reverence. And my mother spent a period of time when we were children not taking us on Sunday morning. And when I asked her about that in the years to follow, she said that one felt too Christian for her humanism, and one felt too bra-burning of the 70s. So she felt that she didn't have a place to connect in either place. And in the 70s, being a feminist and burning your bra was a big deal. But she was a mother who was home with 3 kids just trying to raise a family. There wasn't a place for her that connected. I know for me, growing up in the 70s, I was taught that Transcendentalists were exemplars of our faith, but I also yearned to go back to nature. I yearned for something, and I know that that expression of being able to connect to a community and being able to connect to nature was something I wanted. I wanted to go to Walden Pond. I felt a connection that asked of me to pull myself towards ritual. And when we did finally go back to the congregation when I was a teenager, it was really important that the minister at the time was a Buddhist. And he taught me, as a Unitarian Universalist Buddhist, that ritual is something that helped me be in the present moment. So I think about how Transcendentalism and Humanism both were explicitly taught, but where did we find a place in the middle for the language of reverence? The history of religion, not the institution of religion, but the intention and the purpose of religion is that human beings have always created a faith for themselves. Each of us creates a faith for ourselves. Because we have been cultivating a sense of wonder of the ineffable. Our whole lives, we try to make sense of our place in the universe, of our connections to each other, and to the significance of us being alive. And we have always brought our experiences of the natural world, of philosophy, and of science to create meaning. This is not just a rational exercise. This is something that we do in order to make sense of our lives. And when we make sense of that understanding, then we are challenged to be connected to that which is around us. I want to admit that I am a Humanist Manifesto geek. I am a person who read not only the first one from 1933, the dry document that it was, but also the second Humanist Manifesto from the 70s, and then the third one from 2003. And I think it's because I was seeking for something as a humanist to connect me back to my language of reverence. And when I read the Humanist Manifesto from 2003 in seminary, I felt so connected to that. My heart sang. Certainly, it acknowledged all that was going on in the 1930s about science and a sense of human potential. But, as we all know, that which happened from 1933 on was the Holocaust, for example, was world wars, was starvation, was the advent of nuclear power. It was the feminist movement and the postmodernist movement, and all of us sought during those years a sense of who we are as moral human beings. Those historical challenges and questions that shaped humanism now lead us to a place where we are dealing with our looming environmental crisis. The 2003 Humanist Manifesto recognizes that we are connected to each other and to the natural world in a way that we have no possibility of ever denying. The manifesto itself brings to the forefront of thought that we are not the pinnacle of experience. Instead, we are part of something bigger and grander, and that humanism itself needs and requires a language of reverence for us to experience awe. The awe of nature through the means of science so that we can be connected to each other and to our existence and to ourselves. So if somebody asks me, what does Unitarian Universalism mean? And I don't want to give them this huge, long elevator speech. It's even harder to say, well, I'm a humanistic religious naturalist. But that's what you got today. You got my explanation of basically where I am coming from, is that I am a humanist that seeks ritual and community and finds myself connected to the earth, sometimes even to the point where I need to be barefoot on the earth in order for me to feel the fullness of being alive. We are at a place where we are converging in our histories. Karen Armstrong, an amazing writer who writes about religion, said, "In the course of my studies, I discovered that the religious quest is not about discovering the truth or the meaning of life. but it is about living as intensely as possible in the here and now. The idea is not to latch onto something superhuman or to get to heaven, but instead to discover how to be fully human in this moment. Spiritual practice is how I stay grounded. Ritual is how I stay grounded. And I do that with you. I do that by participating in joys and concerns on a weekly basis. I do that by being in relationship with you and by looking into your eyes from up here. It is so good to be able to do that. Do you have a spiritual practice in your life that makes you more loving? Do you have a spiritual practice that changes the way you live? Perhaps your spiritual practice is joining together here on Sundays. Because coming to worship on a Sunday is more than going to a meal to share with friends, more than going to a book club or a social gathering. It is an embodied experience of being in community for this brief time. Let this worship be a sacramental act that brings you back to the present moment. Let it be a ritual that brings you to your fullest expression. Let it remind you and each other that we are fully alive, and let this community hold you. Let it hold you into the deepness of unfolding to become. I'm going to close with this one story. This one story by a writer named Jane Yolen. Jane Yolen has written so many different children's books. She is a writer that talks of dragons and tales and mountains and feats of exploring the world. And she talked about a little girl who always wanted to go on an adventure. And yet, as many cultures have, if you are a small child and you don't have the means in order to be out in the world and exploring, and you are told to work, you will have to sit and use your imagination to go on your adventures. So this little girl was told that she needed to be the apprentice to learn how to become a weaver like her grandmother. So she would look at the colors of the thread, and she would imagine that she was weaving this great tapestry of the adventure that she wanted to have. And it turned out, in Jane Yolen's story about this little girl, is that this little girl had special powers. She was able to weave into her tapestries something that could come into being. She was magical. And yet, things happen in our lives. Fires happen, tornadoes happen, COVID happens, a pandemic happens. So her tapestries included both beautiful and wonderful adventures and difficulties. And her grandmother came to her one day and said, "I see you have the magic in you." Because the strands of this tapestry, the patterns and the colors and all that go into your imagination, one area is the weft and another area is the warp when you weave. And for us, what's important is to know that those strands, those threads are coming so close together. The warp is the things that we can control, and the weft are the things we can't. And it is our possibility to know that the intersection of those two is where the magic happens. That we can choose how we react when things happen, like fires and tornadoes and pandemics. And these strands never become one. The tapestry can always be unraveled, but it is our ability to live in between the warp and the weft that give us the magic. And this is where we reside all our lives. This is when we come together and we can acknowledge how we respond to things that come across our paths. This is why I'm here. I need you to help me with the combination of the warp and the weft of my life. I need rituals that bring me back in community to be with you so that I can deal with the things that come along. And being present in this moment with you, this is what worship is. Worship is collectively dealing with the warp and the weft and the acknowledgement of that liminal space, that place where we can be aware of the choices we have to make about the things that happen. So thank you for being a part of my religious life. Thank you for helping me find meaning in ritual by being together with you. Thank you for helping me find that space between the warp and the weft and finding the magic in being together.